Okay, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Got a nice turnout today for our webinar, Stage 0 River Restoration and Introduction. If you've got any questions today, if you can just pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address some of these at the end of today's session. We've allowed an hour for today's session, but depending on questions, it might be slightly shorter or slightly longer. We're really pleased to welcome Stewart Clark with us today. He's a national specialist for freshwater catchments with the National Trust, and he's over 20 years experience in freshwater conservation and management. He's really passionate about the restoration of freshwater and wetland ecosystems, and and a focus on catchment and water and how this can transform landscapes for nature as well as people. So he's here today to talk to us about Stage 0 river restoration, or a full floodplain reconnection, which is an exciting development in river restoration. So Stewart, thank you for joining us, and I'll pass the baton over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try and share my screen now, just to get us started. Sarah, can I just check that that's working okay and everyone can see that?
All working fine, Stewart. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, as I say, good afternoon, everybody. Sarah has introduced me. I work for the National Trust, so work in a central team across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, providing kind of support to our properties and projects. And I'm going to talk today about some things that we've been doing in the Trust, and I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of others who've done lots of this work, and in particular our team who are based at the Honeycutt estate in Exmoor, who've been doing some of this Stage 0 work. But it's an opportunity, I think, to talk about something which has really kind of secured lots of interest from lots of people around the UK at events like the River Restoration Conference. And actually the team down at Honeycutt have hosted lots and lots of site visits. And it's kind of remarkable actually about how much interest there is in what they've been doing, which is essentially taking a technique that's been developed in the US and applying it in this country. And I'm just wanted to give a very introductory talk really to sort of describe what we mean by Stage 0, or as I've put here, full floodplain connectivity restoration, where the origins are, and say a little bit about where some of the opportunities might be. And hopefully that will be enough to kind of pique your interest and maybe prompt you to do some more reading, or indeed go and have a look at one of the examples of this type of restoration somewhere around the UK. Move on slide. I hope this works. Is that working? Hope it's moved on for you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So just as a bit of context for this, one of the things that is often debated, particularly in the sort of river restoration scientific literature, but also whenever there's a kind of conference around river restoration, is okay, so we're doing lots of work around increasing physical habitat diversity, putting meanders back into rivers, changing the plan form, changing the bed form, bed raising, floodplain reconnection, but actually how effective is it really? And when you look through the literature, actually you find quite a lot of conflict and also not many great examples of ecological success. And there's been a number of reviews in recent years which have sort of said, despite all of this effort that we're putting in, we don't always see the ecological outcomes that we would have expected. And lots of reasons are given for that, from not dealing with all of the problems, so improving physical habitat, but not necessarily improving water quality, or improving physical habitat in individual reaches, but not addressing the wider catchment scale issues, or not addressing the immediate upstream reaches, through to the fact that we've had a depleted species pool and the species are just not there to kind of capitalize on those improvements. So very difficult to say why that isn't the case, but what seems to be happening is that in channel improvements seem to be less apparent in these restoration schemes than what happens with the sort of riparian bank. And those of you who are familiar with the biodiversity net gain metric will for rivers will probably realize that within that a huge amount of emphasis is placed on what is happening in the riparian zone. And I think it's something that we just need to bear in mind with kind of river restoration, that despite lots of effort focused on channels, it is the kind of interaction between the river, the riparian zone and the floodplain that's really quite critical, and also that wider catchment context. And I think what we've seen in increasingly in recent years is kind of more of a focus on doing things with the associated kind of habitats around river channels, rather than just simply tinkering around with the channel itself, which has sort of been very much where traditional river restoration started, and has focused. This is an example of some work from within the trust. This is Scarrow Beck, which is a tributary of the River Bure, so it's a sort of chalk stream in North Norfolk, and you can see the work that's been done there is as much about sort of addressing adjacent wetland and open water habitat, and as it is about things that were done in the channel, which has largely remained in the same position. And we've been doing quite a lot of this work, as have lots of organisations, lots of Rivers Trust, wildlife trusts, and indeed statutory agencies have been doing this sort of work for many years now, thinking about not just the channel but the wider context and that connection to the sort of surrounding landscape, and trying to put some of those wetland and open water features back into the floodplain. And this is kind of a recognition really that rivers are much bigger than simply the river channel, and this is a rather useful diagram, I think, which sort of actually looks at all of those kind of parts of the river system and those connections, which kind of shows rivers as being much bigger and much more connected than just a simple channel running through a dry landscape. And I think this is widely recognised, that the river and its floodplain and the valley bottom are actually one and part of the same thing, and there are lots of interactions between that and the surrounding landscape. But also thinking about the vertical dimension, lots of interchange between water that sits within the channel and sort of the subsurface groundwater, and moving laterally into the floodplain as well. So this kind of concept of thinking about rivers as much broader systems than just the channel, and indeed thinking about the floodplain as the wet weather channel, whereas the channel that we typically think of to bankful as being the dry weather channel, is kind of increasingly picked up. And you can see that in not just the world of ecology, but also when we think about flood storage and where water sits within the landscape, and how we can reconnect river and floodplain in order to store flood water. And this is really picking up on a kind of direction of travel, particularly in the sort of fluvial geomorphological literature, but which is sort of increasingly recognised that that traditional view of rivers as a single channel is probably a little bit oversimplistic, and that rivers are much larger, more complex systems than that. So I think there's a few things on this slide which sort of highlight how thinking about rivers in their landscapes has changed, and it's really well illustrated, I think, by the set of images on the right hand side, which show what's happened to the Danube and the Danube floodplain through kind of centuries of human modification, but really moving from a very complex dynamic system which is highly connected across and through the landscape, to something which is much more simplistic, single channel. And this is a story that we have sort of seen through all of our river systems, essentially in sort of populated parts of the world, is that we've gradually simplified them, both in terms of their lateral complexity and connectivity, but also their upstream and downstream. And that has a cost for how these things work. So that high level of connectivity, the fact that water ends up on the floodplain during periods of high flow, or is in contact with areas of the floodplain, gives us opportunities for nutrients to be cycled, for carbon to be transferred. So it gives us a high degree of buffering, which helps with water quality, it helps with energy flows, and obviously helps sort of biological communities as well, and provides lots of different niches for things to survive in. And I think looking back through time, as this kind of image of the Danube shows, there's a kind of increasing recognition that actually these multi-channel forms running through the landscape are actually much more common than we think they are, largely because most of what we've been left with are these single river threads running through the landscape because of human modification. And this leads us on to this kind of stage zero idea, and I'm going to go into the theoretical concept a little bit more in a moment. But essentially, this is a kind of an idea which has come out of a, a sort of an academic piece of work thinking about how rivers and streams evolve through time and in relationship to pressures. So there's kind of a theoretical underpinning to the idea of what we mean by stage zero, which I will try and explain to you shortly. But in parallel, there's been a kind of restoration approach pioneered by people in the northwest of the United States, in particular the US Forest Service, but people who've been working with them, who've essentially looked at river systems that had been impacted within the last 100 years and thought about how they might restore them to a kind of pre-disturbance state, and taking them back to this stage zero kind of concept, which is in the diagram on the left-hand side. So if we just take a look at the kind of theoretical underpinning of stage zero and what it is and why it has this rather unusual name, we need to go back to work in the US. So 2008, two geomorphologists working not in the northwest of the US, but over towards in the northeast, around in New England, and looking at lots of streams and trying to work out what happened to those streams sort of in the years sort of following European kind of settlement in the US. And discovering that actually these valley bottoms were very full of silt and very full of sort of fine material that had accumulated since that sort of Europeans had arrived and started to change streams in the way that they had done over Europe for centuries. And what they were finding was that actually, rather than the simple channel that they were seeing now, if you look back, you could find evidence of lots of small anabranching or anastomosing, so channels that were crossing and linking with one another within extensive wetlands, which were behaving in a very different way to what the current streams were like. And these current streams in this area of the US were kind of deep incised, was sort of set in valleys where there was lots of deep accumulated sediment, and largely as a result of people building mill dams, which of course is a characteristic across the whole of kind of Western Europe, if not more widely, from sort of the medieval period onwards. Lots of mill structures built, dams to feed mills and mill leats, and behind those dams, sediment accumulating and essentially filling in the valley floor. So this kind of discovery in the US, which would appear to apply in Europe as well, essentially made people think about, well, actually, what was the kind of reference point? What was the pre-disturbance kind of point for many of our lowland streams? And that work has sort of gone along in parallel with kind of a much more of a growing recognition that there is not simply one single river type, and that actually we have lots of different river types, and that often depends on how much energy the river has and the sediment that it's working with. So from bedrock through to kind of large boulders, cobbles and sand, through to the more kind of finer cohesive sediments of kind of clays and sands that we might be more used to in lowland environments. And when you look at sort of this work on different river types, um, what you start to see is that many of the sort of stream types that we would characterize as being lowland streams, the things that we've been trying to recreate through river restoration, are kind of single channel meandering reaches. So everything in the middle here, sort of from 13, 14, 17, 18, 20 and 21 are the sort of typical uh, characteristic lowland rivers that people have been trying to recreate and assumed were there. But actually what we can see is that we, there are these multi-channel type systems that are shown in here, but numbered sort of 19 and 22. And in particular, 22 is the sort of multi-channel wetland that Walter and Merritt's study in the US was trying to identify and was finding in those northeastern US streams pre-disturbance. And when you apply this to the stream evolution model, which is where we get our stage 0 through to stage 8, what we see is that before the kind of single meandering river that we're all kind of used to seeing in lowland environments, which is typified here by stage 1, there was another stage, a stage 0, which has multiple channels, where we have these very small shallow channels running through either a wet woodland environment or a kind of grassy wetland system, where actually we're not inset within the floodplain, we are at the level of the floodplain, and we have lots of small channels interacting with one another. So this was kind of introducing a new stage, hence stage 0, into this geomorphological evolution model, which shows how streams go through a series of natural processes, but enhanced through human activity, through a series of stages and of degradation, sort of gradually cutting down into the landscape, and then infilling with sediment over time. As conditions change, which is what was described through stages 1 to 8. So this is where the term stage 0 comes from. And if we sort of understand how stage 0 systems work a little bit, this is a useful diagrams. And this set of pictures on the left is an image of the restoration process in one of these US Forest Service case studies. So we start off at the top with a reach which has been degraded, where the river is very separate from the floodplain. And if you look at where it's located in this diagram, you sort of see that it's way down in the bottom right hand corner, where we're saying we have very high erosion resistance. So we've got sort of rocks and cobbles and boulders, which you can see there. And we have high stream power, so very erosive, very kind of dominated by both the hydrology and the underlying rock and kind of hard substrates. But through the restoration process, which we'll talk about a bit later on, it's shifted in the second picture down into a place where we've got much finer sediments, so we've still got high stream power, high hydrology. Water is a dominant process, but we're seeing potentially lots of interaction with the erosion. And then in the final image, which is the bottom one, which is a sort of later state of recovery, we've moved up into the top sort of point of this triangle, which is essentially where we have really high levels of biological interaction. So plants in particular and trees are playing a really strong role in defining what happens within this reach. So we're seeing a situation where we're not having lots of erosion. We've dissipated lots of the stream power, so we've not got highly erosive flows coming through, largely because the effect of the biology of the plant communities is kind of holding that system very much together and holding lots of that fine material in place. So we have a dominance of biology in this sort of stage zero reach, in contrast to some of the other river types. So it's very much a kind of an ecologist's river system, if you like, where the interaction between water, sediment, and biology is very strong, and where ecology has the upper hand and is controlling what happens. So our team from the Honeycutt estate, through some conversations that I'd been having with Colin Thorne, who used to work at the University of Nottingham, but was doing lots of work in the US with the US Forest Service, the team who were working on our Honeycutt project managed to go and have a look at some of these schemes, these river restoration schemes that have been going on in the US. And essentially, you can sort of get an idea here of the scale of those sorts of projects, with huge pieces of wood that have been deliberately kind of placed within the channel to try and encourage this biotic interaction, to slow the flows, to create sedimentation, to take the energy out of the system and encourage the development of lots and lots of channels rather than eroding back down to one, and creating a system where the ecology, the biology is driving what goes on, and we've got a high degree of connectivity. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with Exmoor, but it doesn't quite look like this. And I think the team were really kind of confused to start with, having a look at some of these case studies and thinking, actually, how does this apply here? And is this a completely different system? But then they did go and look at some smaller schemes, and I think it kind of opened people's eyes about what was possible. And they went back to Exmoor and looked at some of the small streams on the estate and kind of started to look at them in different ways, and this sort of feeling that many of our sort of lowland streams that were in the kind of vales of Exmoor, very different to what they'd been seeing, and perhaps very different to what they'd been like in the past. So this took the team on a journey, and we did some preparatory work on this, and they did a very small scale stage zero, which is called Mudpool Meadow, which was essentially a small stream running down the side of a field. As you can see from the text on this side, it was done very quickly, just obtaining a land drainage consent, a couple of weeks of work with some machinery, using a local contractor. And essentially what they did, in simple terms, is filled in the old river channel, regraded the site, and added lots of woody material across it to try and encourage the water to flow out across the surface, with low energy, lots of interaction with the substrate, lots of opportunity to store sediment, to enable things like nutrient cycling, but also creating more of a wetland environment rather than a simple river channel. And they applied the technique that the US had been using, which is essentially just looking at the valley bottom and working out how do you kind of get everything level at the lowest point in the valley so that the water flows through the lowest point. So it's a simple kind of cut and fill type operation, trying to get the over deepened in size channel to fill in, and or actually actively filling that in, removing some of the higher points in the floodplain that may be dredged material that's been disposed, and trying to create a new surface for that water to flow across. And this is what the outcome of that was in Mudpool Meadow. So you sort of see, and it's quite hard to see in this sort of second slide what you end up with, but essentially it is a kind of wetland of very small, slow flowing channels, with sort of woody material left in initially to sort of make sure that some of those erosive forces that the river might have, particularly when it's in high flow, um, through the system. So if we have a sort of look at this a bit more closely, it's quite hard to see in this image where the water flows, but once you're going to get in there, you can really see, and this is another part of the site at an earlier time of the year, but you can essentially see that we have much more of a wetland environment with multiple channels flowing through, rather than a single typical river channel as we would understand it. And what we think is that in these sorts of situations, we're storing lots of water, we're allowing lots of sediment to kind of fall out and accumulate and settle, but we're also increasing the amount of contact that the water has with that wetland environment, and we're getting all of the benefits associated with that in terms of nutrient cycling, and also sort of habitat creation as well. So having had success with the smaller site, the team then started to think about the River Aller, which is the sort of main river site flowing through the estate, and in particular identified a reach through an area of the estate. It's very much lowland part of the estate, and a river channel which you can sort of see running in this line of trees. It's barely perceptible in that the large image on this slide. But a close-up shown in the smaller image, you can see the sort of channel it is. So we have a single channel. We have basically we either have lots of water in the channel, or very little at all. Very little connectivity with the surrounding landscape, except for times of really high flows and flood. Limited in-channel habitat, limited riparian habitat, and the implication here and the assumption is that this water is moving through the landscape very, very quickly, transporting water, pollutants and sediments through and into the next reach downstream, and ultimately into the coastal waters of the Bristol Channel in this instance. So applying exactly the same technique as the Mudpool Meadow site, so the smaller site that we've just described, set about doing exactly the same thing on the main river, which I can certainly talk about this later on when we go through questions and discuss stuff, but a really kind of difficult job to negotiate some of the permissions and consents for this, which I won't talk about at the moment, but getting to the point where the valley bottom was kind of re-engineered, the river channel itself filled in to create this large 7-hectare wetland, rather than a simple channel running through the trees. And what we have is we have multi-channel system, lots of shallow anastomosing or anabranching streams running through a wetland, always in contact with the sort of valley bottom and the floodplain. And as you can see, lots of kind of interaction with plant communities and trees and scrub on the valley bottom. So you can sort of see a bit of an image on the right of before and after, going from a sort of single line through the landscape into this more complex system. And I've got a few more photographs to follow which sort of show you this. So the site itself was 1.2 kilometers, which was largely straight and very much over deepened, as I've shown you already. And after that restoration, we've got a 7-hectare sort of multi-channel wetland. In order to create that, a large amount of woody material which came from across the site, as in across our estate, was used within that, just to kind of ensure that the whole system didn't reset if we had really high flows before vegetation had really got established. And in order to achieve that, lots of plants and trees were introduced as well to kind of stabilize the soils before sort of high flows started to come through. And the site continues to develop with a kind of an increasing complexity, and really quite an abundance of wildlife starting to appear within this site as well. So now just a few images of before and then after. If you look at the tree in the center of this picture lying down. That's a good reference point, as are the trees in the open field up towards the top. You maybe can orientate yourself and just see how the site has been changed over time. So this is during the works. So creating and leveling off the site through the valley bottom to make sure that all the levels were right. So where the water would flow once the old channel was filled in. And this is an image of what it's like after some of that vegetation growth has come back, some of that planting has taken hold, and getting to the point where you really wouldn't be able to tell that work had taken place. And you can see in this image, hopefully, the sort of volume of sort of woody material and large branches that have been added in to try and add that complexity and stabilize the site at the start. And then another image which shows that quite clearly from the beginning of last year. And that's what it was looking like this summer. Held up really well in a very dry period. And we have some sort of anecdotal evidence that actually this was very much wetter than the surrounding landscape during the dry summer that we've just had. And we have got some monitoring in place, so it's too early to share the results of this, but we've got monitoring in place to try and work out what's happening with groundwater, because we're really interested in the potential of this sort of reach for retaining groundwater and for wider drought resilience. So we have some monitoring in place to help us detect that, and early indications are that the site has done very well in that context over this summer. We're working with the University of Exeter on that and the University of Nottingham. The University of Exeter have also looked at flood events, and I will caveat this by saying these are also very early results, but essentially this graph is some very early analysis of an individual flood event, and the green line is a site which is post-restoration, the red line is pre-restoration, and what we're seeing is for the same sort of rainfall event, which is on our x-axis, we're actually seeing slightly lower flows, and that's statistically significant. It looks to be around just under 40% lower than the pre-restoration, so a really clear potential downstream flood risk benefit with storing this amount of water in those small channels rather than it funneling through in a single channel immediately. And we're hoping that as the site continues to develop and we get more vegetation growth, that we'll be able to get more data of this nature and be able to say more about the kind of potential flood risk benefits of restoring reaches like this. So I've said quite a lot about the potential benefits of these kind of stage zero restorations or these stage zero reaches. And there's just a list of things here. We've talked quite a bit about hydrological benefits, so for flood and drought resilience, but potentially benefits from a geomorphological perspective in terms of stabilizing the channel and encouraging sediment deposition, and providing a bit of resilience to the system by ensuring that there's places which remain wet and have taken the energy out of the system through dry periods, but also from an ecological perspective, creating much more kind of complex habitats, a wetland environment rather than a simple river channel surrounded by dry habitat. And these shallow channels, which are very connected to groundwater, potentially having real benefits for temperature as well, and as well as kind of benefits for water quality through holding on to fine sediment, potentially holding on to pollutants, and encouraging nutrient cycling and storing carbon. And this image is actually a picture of a beaver wetland, and probably some of you have already thought this, that the sorts of habitats that we're creating through stage zero is very similar to kind of beaver wetland kind of complexes as well. And there is a very strong link between what beavers are doing on these kind of small lowland streams, and what stage 0 restoration is trying to achieve as well. I've talked a lot about National Trust sites and Honeycutt, but there are other people doing this work around the UK as well. So I just want to take a moment just to kind of mention a few other stage 0 sites. This is some work that Matt Parr from the Environment Agency has been doing in Lincolnshire, and Matt's been really kind of driving forward this approach and similar things in that part of the world, doing some brilliant work. This is on the River Witham, so in Lincolnshire, sort of just south of Grantham, and this is kind of a restored stage 0 reach there, which before was essentially a very straightened ditch running through the landscape, barely visible, and filled in and allowing the water to spread out across the valley bottom there, using woody material in the same way. And this work was done pretty much at the same time as the work on the River Aller at Honeycutt. A different sort of approach to this work that the Environment Agency and Atkins did on the River Evenlode, on the tributary of the Evenlode, the Dawn, where rather than filling in the channel, they have created a series of kind of leaky dams to try and encourage siltation. So taking the view that by putting sort of barriers in the channel, it will fill itself over time, but then also lowering the banks to allow water to spill out, and essentially trying to encourage the River Dawn to do its own stage 0 by filling up with sediment and spilling water out across the floodplain. And there's quite a nice set of drone images which sort of show the progression of that site from a single channel on the left-hand side through to a more kind of extensive wetland system, particularly at high flows. Some of those images show as you move across to the right. And in a similar way, very much kind of driven by experience from the US and thinking about what sort of habitats could be created within that system, and using LiDAR to help identify the sort of areas of water depth and therefore the sorts of habitats that could be expected to develop within that system. So I've mentioned a few of these. There are other sites around the country which have either been explicitly trying to achieve a stage 0 state or have done things that are in a very similar way. And I'm sure there are many more that I've missed on this kind of summary map, but essentially to show that there is a growing interest in this sort of approach and a growing number of case studies which have elements of this kind of stage 0 kind of outcome. There's also been a really nice piece of opportunity mapping work funded by the Environment Agency and Dorset Wildlife Trust, which Peter Stone has been doing, which is essentially sort of looking across entire catchments in Dorset and looking at what the potential is. So essentially trying to identify where the actual valley bottom is, which isn't always where the river is flowing these days, and then trying to look at what the constraints and opportunities for restoration might be, and creating a kind of heat map of opportunities at a kind of catchment scale, which can then be used for people to kind of look and think about where the potential might be for these sorts of projects. Coming back to National Trust sites now, we've been doing things as well which are not stage 0, but are trying to create some of the similar kind of outcomes as well. So I've mentioned beaver sites, but this is a river, sort of more traditional river restoration scheme, you might argue, Goldrill Beck up in the Lake District, which was kind of a case of moving from a single channel, very fast flowing, which was threatening a road and sort of undermining the road which ran beside it, and putting the river back into a kind of place further in the bottom of the floodplain and trying to create a much more kind of multi-channel system. And at the bottom end of this, it runs through a kind of wet woodland site, very much in the sort of same way as some of those stage 0 examples that we've talked about. And I've already talked about sort of beavers and the things that they might do in these places, and we've got a series of sites around the trust where we have beavers. and the wetlands that they create, which essentially create these kind of really complex wetland environments with shallow water spreading through them in a similar way. And if we think about what we're trying to achieve through stage 0 sites, it is very similar to, as I've said, to what beavers are doing. And there's some really interesting work, which this diagram is a great illustration of, in the US, in very sort of degraded streams where they're very incised and there isn't much opportunity for beavers to kind of get a hold because their dams keep getting washed away. But using these beaver dam analogues where people kind of go in, it's rather like the even load example of actually constructing barriers that then start to change the system. And in this diagram, that is being used essentially to make it easier for beavers to move in and create the sort of wetlands that we see on the far right of this diagram, which are very similar to the sorts of things that we've been just talking about in terms of stage 0. And the reason I mention all of these things is that essentially all of those examples are trying to create pockets of wetland online in river systems, which Ellen Wall, who is a US geomorphologist, calls river beads. And it's a really nice concept, I think, to kind of illustrate how once our river systems were kind of these kind of strings of kind of wetlands, then separated by sort of more simple channels that then flowed into wetlands. And we had a whole series of beads which would have had high biodiversity, high ecosystem function, all of the things we've talked about with stage 0 reaches. And through modification, we've largely removed all of those wetland reaches and those sorts of systems. But what if we were to create some of those again? What if we were to put beaver wetlands, stage 0 restored reaches, and other sorts of river restoration reaches? Presumably, the more of those we put through the river network, the more of those benefits that we will get. And I rather like this idea of kind of repopulating the landscape with these river beads for all of the benefits they can provide. Then, sort of in a way to preempt some questions, I suppose, I think there's lots of interest, there's lots of conversation around stage 0, and I fear that there's a risk that we might run away with some kind of misconceptions about what it is and where it might fit. So I just wanted to kind of try and tackle a few of those things before I finish. So that stage 0 is a new way to restore rivers, that it's the best way to restore rivers, and actually all it is about restoring rivers with their floodplain, and we've been doing that for years. So what's new? So first of all, is it the new way to restore rivers? Well, it's just simply a reference point, I would argue, which might help us define a restoration approach. It's not. There are many ways we can restore rivers. This is a reference point to which we may want to restore to, or we may wish to kind of look to the future with. Is it the optimal way? Well, it's not going to work everywhere. I hope I've conveyed the fact that it's very much a lowland technique. It's for depositional reaches because gradient manages. And there will be many occasions where we simply won't be able to do that. And so we need to kind of return to some of the other ways that we can reinstate natural processes. And I've listed a few of those there. And then some people might say, well, this is what we've been doing for a long time. It's just about reconnecting the river with its floodplain. And I would say there are two things that probably distinguish stage 0 from typical floodplain reconnection projects. One is that we are kind of trying to reset the valley bottom. And then the other thing, which I hope I've managed to convey, is this idea that actually we're trying to reconnect the water with the valley bottom or the floodplain at all flows. So low flows as well as high flows, not just when it floods, but all the time. And that's the real benefit of this. So if I were to try and conclude and make some generalizations about this, I think this is another tool that looks to have significant benefits for both ecology and for ecosystem function, and potentially for a whole suite of ecosystem benefits, but in particular drought and flood resilience. It isn't applicable everywhere, but definitely can be used alongside some of the other techniques we've been using already in river restoration. I think it's right to see it in the context of other things that we're doing in our river systems, such as reintroducing beavers and other kind of river restoration techniques, and that we could potentially really significantly improve our river networks by putting more of these kind of high functioning, highly connected systems within them, or river beads as we might call them. And I think it's kind of a move in the right direction, and it's a recognition that we need to kind of think not just about the river channel, but the whole landscape, and think about freshwater recovery as a kind of endeavour for the whole of the landscape. So this is an image I shared earlier on. I just think it's kind of really inspiring. The picture in the top right is a river system, which I think we'd probably be more than happy with in the UK, or indeed across most of Western Europe. But actually in the US, that's a pre-project image. And the image in the bottom is one of the river restoration schemes that they've kind of achieved through a stage zero approach. So we haven't got anything on that scale, but maybe we can do something with our own rivers that is befitting of this. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop and pick up anything that's in the chat.
Thank you, Stuart. That was really interesting, and I love the idea of the river beads. It gives a really clear picture of what you're trying to achieve, I think. Yeah, so we've got quite a few questions in the chat. We have quite a few that were mentioned beavers actually, which you covered quite a bit. So let's have a look. So there's a couple of questions actually about if we're trying to slow the rivers down, and in effect it becoming shallower. How's that going to affect fish populations that require deeper, faster water, and do we need to consider that when we're thinking about our restoration?
Yeah, that's really good questions, and things I think where we need to get more data on. And there's a couple of things I would say about sort of the impact on fish and invertebrates. One is that if we don't really have the data for UK rivers yet. We have some anecdotal stuff, but if we look at what's come out of the US, what we find is that these are incredibly productive reaches when they're restored for both fish and for invertebrates, just because of the sort of habitat quality. So they don't contain, if we think about fish, for example, they don't contain the sort of habitat that suits really big fish, but they are really good places for sort of small fish and sort of for spawning. So we do, although we've got these shallow kind of environments, there are areas of gravel, and they're really apparent within the kind of Allah system, that there are these kind of well oxygenated riffle type reaches and sections alongside more sluggish, slow flowing reaches. So I think there's two things we need to do. We need to kind of get more monitoring and understand, but we also need to, I think, to the second point, which is that bit around river beads, and thinking that actually these are not necessarily, we're not turning to turn all of our river reaches into these kind of these sorts of sections. And so what we're trying to do is create those environments which might be really good for growing on small fish or creating large amounts of kind of invertebrate abundance, that then those smaller fish as larger fish are moving into deeper, faster flowing reaches, which may be upstream or downstream of those. So I hope I've kind of answered that question. I think it's something that we still need to kind of get some UK specific data on as well, to understand what are the real benefits, or what potentially the impacts of doing these things within our lowland river systems.
Definitely. Julia's asked, when doing these restorations, how do you address field drains from adjacent productive lands, and landowner concerns about slowing the flow in these lowland systems instead of maintaining the type of effective drainage that they're used to seeing in the rivers?
Another great question, Julia. One of the things that we've been trying to do actually in the Allah catchment is trying to address some of this historic drainage as well, recognizing that if we don't slow the flows coming down into these reaches, we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve. So, definitely tackling field drainage has been something that we've been really interested in, not just at Honeycutt, but across lots of trust sites. But I do recognise what you say, that it's kind of very much against the kind of what lots of landowners have been doing for a very long time, which is and we sort of have to challenge this kind of idea that shifting water as quickly as possible is the best thing that we can do. And I think the answer to that maybe is, in getting people thinking more about drought resilience, and perhaps, going through the summer that we've just been through, recognizing that hanging on to some water within the landscape maybe is a really good thing for us to be doing, particularly looking into a future which is drier and where droughts are even more common. So I think we have to challenge some of those preconceptions that getting water away as quickly as possible is the best thing to do, and maybe we need to rethink some of those places where we have put land drains in, which would have been more wetland sites, and whether they ought to be wetland sites again to give us that drought resilience in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I think that actually leads into a question from Robert, actually, who is talking about farming land and surface area and how that can be kind of managed with this approach. Um, and creating water reservoirs to avoid or reduce the impact of droughts. And is it something farmers can connect with, or have you seen an interest in?
Um, I'm not sure we've seen any interest in it yet, but I think and I've been part of some conversations recently with the NFU who've I think there's kind of growing awareness, as we might imagine, amongst farming community, that they're being affected by, you know, floods during the winter and during the spring, perhaps, and then, being confronted with really dry conditions, and that actually um, managing water is really kind of critical from an agricultural perspective as well. And I think the default is typically to do those sorts of things, of thinking about on-farm reservoirs as a way of holding back water. I think there's an interesting kind of concept in some of these restored wetlands, some of these sort of stage zero reaches. What would the benefit of that be to agriculture? At the Allah site, it was in an agricultural tenancy. It still is. It's still being grazed. I don't think we know yet, but one might infer that holding on to more water, it might have had more potential as from a grazing perspective than some of the surrounding land that was really well drained. I don't know if that, I don't
Mm,
think we have the data, but there is something about thinking of these kind of habitat restoration and recreation options as being part of the mix and part of the solution for not just the biodiversity and kind of climate crises that we're facing, but also, in helping other ecosystem services and, agricultural systems as well, I think. So I think it's a
mm.
really a good thing to think about. And how do we sell these kind of solutions to people like the agricultural community?
Yeah, definitely. Chris has asking about and talking about river monitoring protocols, and that concentrate quite a lot on aquatic species. But stage zero will encourage a greater mix of aquatic and terrestrial species. So surely this makes the monitoring more complex?
Yes, I think it does make it much more complex. There's a really good paper, Chris, actually, from a US project where they kind of tried to design a monitoring protocol in order to deal with exactly that. And I think this is, one of the challenges that we might face with more of these kind of projects, is that we've very much designed our monitoring approaches on kind of compartmentalized habitats, and if we create these kind of mosaics of habitat, we need to find different ways of kind of understanding what's going on. And I think maybe part of the solution for this is in some of the new tools that we have for monitoring, so using environmental DNA, both from within the water and from uh, collected samples as well, bioacoustics, remote sensing. All of these things potentially help us devise monitoring approaches that might work in these more complex environments.
Definitely. We've got someone's asked about, is there an ideal time of year to construct a stage zero scheme?
Um, as with any work sort of associated with sort of rivers, there's a very kind of small window within which you can work, and what you really want to be doing is kind of avoiding obvious sort of fish spawning and bird breeding um, sort of windows, etc. But also trying to avoid those really high winter flows. So, if I was trying to do a stage zero scheme, I think I'd be trying to do one at this time of the year, sort of right now, while it's still dry. Um, so it's definitely the sort of idea to plan for kind of early autumn type projects, I think, to get those things happening.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple just come in actually about thinking about urban areas and whether there's been any thoughts to applying rivers inside urban areas. And if you did, how could have you got any ideas how you could actually start restoring the floodplain within those urban areas to try and decrease flooding?
So I think there is a project in Enfield, certainly somewhere in North London, which is looking at applying a stage zero type methodology. So I know it's sort of in the design stage, so that's definitely one to watch. I'm sorry, I don't have any more detail on that, but I think there is an interest. And I think there's some really good examples, not necessarily of this, but more of kind of um, reconnecting rivers with floodplain through things like urban parks. And if you
Mm.
sort of take the river bead network to its kind of logical conclusion, I don't see why you couldn't apply a similar kind of approach to urban areas where you might have to live with rivers in culverts and being channeled quite quickly through some parts of the urban environment, but where there's a bit more room, you could potentially create these kind of much more um, complex kind of wetland sort of systems that may have a whole series of benefits. And there's some good examples of urban river restoration projects which have sort of gone in that direction, if perhaps not completely in that direction. But I think increasingly, recognizing the value of kind of blue green space within cities and towns, that this is something we might see more of.
Mm, definitely. Well, I think you've definitely sparked a lot of people's thoughts today and interest in the ideas behind it. It's certainly generated quite a few questions, and we've kind of running out of time to answer them. So,
Yeah.
um, so thank you very much for today. I'm just having a quick look to see if there's anything um, that we've really not touched on at all. Uh,
um, There is a question about consent, which I would say, I
mm,
think, and this comes back to some of the other questions that are in there around fisheries interests and, um, also with monitoring as well, is that, um, I think these are quite different sorts of projects, and I think our experience at Hunnicutt and Exmoor is that it has been quite a difficult thing to take through, kind of a consenting process and planning permissions that are not necessarily designed to think about the things in these ways. Um, and that's been achieved largely through kind of working really closely with people in the Environment Agency, people in the National Park Authority, and actually having an ongoing dialogue around that. But it has been a really difficult thing to kind of agree, and largely because we're doing things that, and we're turning rivers into sort of systems that we don't really have many examples of. So inevitably there are lots of questions about what it's going to look like. And part of this is that these are open-ended projects, and we're not very good at, our consenting processes are not very good at dealing with projects where you say, well, we're not quite sure what it will look like, because it's an interaction between the water and the
yeah.
trees and the plants, and it will develop over time. So I think those are interesting questions, and very much things that we kind of need to deal with as a community, is to work through those as we work through these kind of projects and the consents for them.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. I think we'll draw it to a close there. But thank you very much for giving up your time today to share with everybody your expertise and knowledge on projects ongoing up and down the country. So hopefully people will take a look. So
Yes. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Thanks, Sarah, as well,
thank you very
for
much. Take care.
hosting us.